Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Unfiltered Author Talks. I am delighted to have Charlie Goodyear with us tonight. Charlie wrote a fantastic book about President Garfield. I had the luxury of being able to see him speak just recently here in Fredericksburg, actually, at the University of Mary Washington's Great Live series, and was just very fascinated with his talk and his topic, and ended up having to get the book. Of course, we got to read the book. Without any further ado, Charlie, I'd like to have the floor go to you and let you start us out and introduce yourself a little bit.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Tyler.
Sure.
Yes, my name is Charlie Goodyear. On the cover of my books, I tend to go by CW, which is a name that lets me sound a little bit more older and more experienced than I am. But I'm a biographer and kind of popular historian based in Northern Virginia. And my most recent book was a biography of President James Garfield, who was our nation's 20th president, and really a lot of very impressive work had been done on him by other authors throughout the years. But he was somebody who still kind of escaped popular awareness, interestingly enough. And I found him, as Tyler, as you know, having gone to my talk, I just found him a fascinating figure. And the more I dug into the nuances of his life, it seemed like a very good parable in many ways for our own times. So I found him a really interesting dude. There are a variety of fun facts I could take you through regarding James Garfield. Um, he was the last president to be born in a log cabin. He was raised by a single mother. He could speak several languages fluently. He authored an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He was also a very distinguished Civil War general. But he also founded the Department of Education, interestingly enough. Although, every time I open a newspaper these days, I get worried the Department of Education is going to go away.
No kidding.
Yeah, no, not at all. But he was an American Renaissance man who was regarded during his time as being one of the most accomplished and influential Americans ever. Now, unfortunately, all of that tends to get lost in the historical record, and Garfield's life gets distilled down into just the way that life ended,
Mhm.
which was his assassination. He was the second president to be assassinated. And that tends to be, if anybody remembers him at all, that's usually what springs to mind. And I guess my book was a way of me trying to understand why that shouldn't be the case and present that to the reader.
Right, and I think you did absolute justice to that. Just finishing your book today, actually,
Mm.
so incredible to read this because as a Civil War historian, I know a little bit about Garfield. I know a lot about what happens at Chickamauga, but you even go into some stuff that I didn't ever consider myself, thinking about dating back to Rosecrans, with
Mm.
Garfield kind of stepping in. And he seems almost hesitant at first when Rosecrans is like, "Yeah, my first aide got his head blown off," and
Yeah,
I kind
right.
of was a little too far forward and let this happen. So you're coming with me. I like you, So things like that really, I never really thought about when thinking of Garfield in the Civil War. And there's
Yeah,
plenty of things in your book that I didn't even remotely consider.
yeah.
Uh,
Garfield had this talent, dare I say, if not this weird streak of luck. He was constantly, throughout his life, he was connected or in the background of or quietly dictating the shape of very important events on the national stage. Now, that's not me saying he is like a Machiavellian,
right.
behind the scenes kind of dictating the flow of events, but he had this weird ability to just kind of be in the at the heart of some of the most important uh, events of the middle of the American 19th century, and that includes in the Civil War. He was at not only was he involved after the Civil War in like the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments and all of these constitutional crises, during the Civil War he was also he was nearly staffed to Rutherford Hayes's regiment in Ohio. He fought at the Battle of Shiloh. He and of course, as you're referencing, Garfield was the aide de camp to General William Rosecrans ahead of the Battle of Chickamauga. In many ways, as you probably remember from the book, Garfield made the Battle of Chickamauga happen. He was the one who was agitating in camp, in Rosecrans' camp, for the Union Army to move, for Rosecrans to break camp and take the fight to Braxton Bragg. He was, Garfield. There's no such thing as an Army officer who is Sorry, I should rephrase. Um, Generally, ambitious Army officers want to be in the heart of the action, and
Right.
Garfield is this young, impetuous volunteer Union Army officer. He was a political general. He was a non-professional soldier. You know, he was somebody who, in a very politically savvy way, he wanted to be on the front lines of the conflict, and sometimes that got him into trouble, and it got others into trouble as well. Yeah, but Rosecrans is one of those great personalities of the war. You know, he was of the same stature at times in the war as Ulysses Grant,
Mhm.
as Meade. And then, he suffered from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and Rosecrans Chickamauga became his downfall. And in a very Shakespearean way, his downfall was the result of some conniving, dare I say, some agitation by his aide de camp, and then some actions that Garfield had taken behind the scenes to undermine his own commanding officer. And I've shared that anecdote with some military officer friends of mine, and the idea of a general being undercut behind the scenes politically, being gossiped about to cabinet level officers, to the Secretary of the Treasury, to the Secretary of Defense equivalent, by your chief of staff, that is almost treasonous undercutting of the line of authority. And Garfield did that, which is really interesting. Garfield has this very, because of the way his life ended, some aspects of his personality were sanded down and purified a lot. He had this ambitious streak in him, and I didn't want to undercut that in my writing at all. And I hope that came across during the Chickamauga part.
No, absolutely it did. And I mean that the whole book itself, like one of the things that I found so powerful, not just the Civil War part. Of course, that's where I'm like zeroed into. Like, oh
Right.
yes, we got a Civil War part, almost a whole section. But that brings me up to the sections, and I really liked how you formatted the book,
Oh,
and even
thank
how
you.
you closed out some of these sections. I believe there are three sections or four, where
Yeah,
you
there are three, and then
where,
there's like an epilogue.
mhm.
But you're right. Yes.
And it's just you get the war, the House, and then the presidency. And that was just, it was fantastic because it was broken down into a level where you really gave great attention in each section to Garfield and kind of how he steps from general to congressman to,
Yes.
I don't want to say accidental president, but it really seems like he's like, why are you guys nominating? But to president ultimately.
Yeah. Well, that's something I say. So Garfield, despite how self-effacing he was, first he was, statistically speaking, one of the greatest politicians of all time. He never lost an election his entire life, and he won 9 consecutive House terms, which was an almost unprecedented length of tenure of that time. But yes, so when it came time for him to be nominated for the presidency, and this is his style of getting elected, by the way, he makes a very big show of publicly not being interested in the role. But as many people know, there's no such thing as somebody in Washington who isn't interested in the presidency. So he kept his options open. He was very savvy about that. And yeah, in terms of the style of how I structured the book, I was incorrect before, by the way. You're right. There are 4 sections. There's the wilderness, the war, the
That's
House, and the
right.
presidency. And the reason I broke it out this way, I kind of knocked my head against a wall a couple of times trying to figure out how to structure this book, and I ended up going with those 4 things because those were things that he was able to conquer in different ways. He was born in what was at the time still the American wilderness. He overcame that through just a manic work ethic, really. The war, Garfield entered the war. He believed in the righteousness of the Union cause. He also did see opportunity in it to win glory for himself, and that's exactly what he did. He goes into the war as the youngest state senator in Ohio, and he ends the war as one of the youngest congressmen in the nation, having been one of the youngest generals in the Union Army. And then you have the House. And by the end of that section, Garfield is minority leader of the House of Representatives. He is the most senior Republican left in the House of Representatives after Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And then the presidency is the last thing that gets thrust upon him. And I'd argue that he does well in the time that he has. From an editorial perspective, I really wanted to show just how accomplished and impressive he was as an American and as a man. There's an old cliche about biographers that they always get asked, would you want to get a meal with your subject? Would you want to sit down and eat with him? And I actually don't want to do that. I don't want, not because he wouldn't be charming. He would be. By all accounts, including by fellow presidents, he was one of the most friendly and charming and intriguing men of his era on our continent. But I think it would be much more fun to walk James Garfield along our national mall here in Washington, D.C., and I would start at the Lincoln Memorial, and then I would end at the Capitol building. So I would go the entire length of it, west to east, and I would show him everything we've done as a nation. I would show him all these wonderful free museums we have. I would kind of walk him through it, the way the nation has progressed, and indeed humanity has progressed since his time. And then I would end at the southwest corner of the Capitol building where there's a big statue of him.
I was going to ask that right
Yeah,
there, right?
and I would say, and you see all this, and here you are. We have not forgotten you. You are still looking out over all of us. And I think, he led a distinctly American life. His life, in more ways than many, embodied the full evolution and complexities and failures of our nation throughout that time. And I think there's a lot to learn from his life. I still believe that, and I think he would find a lot to be interested in how we're doing today. Now, obviously, I wish we lived in less interesting times.
Yeah.
But it would definitely capture his intellect, if anything. To think, some of this might sound a little bit familiar to him.
Yeah, and that's another thing I found really interesting with your book was reading through the book. I actually found that some of the things Garfield's dealing with, both in the House and in the early stages of his presidency, not that it was a lengthy presidency, but his early stages, it's almost like you could see some of these headlines today. And, that was kind of really fascinating to see in that book.
Yeah, it's yes, it's what's that old bit? It's like presidential election thrown into dispute. I wonder where we've seen that before.
Right.
The detail being, of course, Garfield had to get through the election of 1876, and he was one of the judges. History doesn't repeat or does rhyme a lot, and that really is that was something that stuck out to me as well. The other thing that really struck out to me was how he was a learned person. This was also an easy editorial. Every day of James Garfield's diary entries are made for the year 1878. He started each day with a new verse. He was applying that day-to-day life. And so when I read in his diaries, impressed, one, by somebody who was that knowledgeable, that well-read Shakespeare. Two, I was impressed that it was a politician of all people who was able to apply that to day-to-day life. And three, I wanted to use that to kind of headline each of the in my book. So that was my experience. That was another easy call that I made when it came to those details. What stuck out to you, by the way, with those things that sound familiar? How would you?
Honestly, the Department of Education.
Did you notice of that in the book?
It would definitely have to fall onto the Department of Education because obviously that's something that's in the headlines. Yeah, it did. It looked like, if I remember correctly, because I breezed, it was fantastic to read, but I had to get this 180 pages down today. The Department of Education seemed to almost dissipate after Garfield, even though he makes this department and really tries to help that. But it looks like it almost goes away and doesn't come back for another decade or 100 years even. Do I have that right?
That's right. So what happens is he creates a Department of Education as a reconstruction measure. So, as in the aftermath of the Civil
Mhm.
War, you're having what Garfield perceives to be all of these new Americans, of kind of not appearing, but being freed in the post-South, and to new
Mhm.
millions of people into what it means citizens. So he actually says to the House, um, are we to expand the bounds of and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the city? He's basically asking us to seize the opportunity of times, which is to create a new, to make the most of this era that was upon us as a nation. And that, by the way, it's not only as it relates to the post or South, it's also in regard to the millions of new Americans that are appearing in the Northeastern U.S. as a result of from Europe.
Mhm.
So he has to fight very hard to get this through the House. And what ends up happening, and again, this will sound very familiar to him, um, eventually the fiscal hawks start surfing, and they eventually strip
Mhm.
or move to strip a lot of the funds away from this new creation of Garfield's. So he lives long enough to see this creation of his busted down to a bureau within the Department of the Interior. So it could have gone better for sure, but it was a really remarkably bold uh, policy action of that time. And again, it was very prescient in many ways for him to create something like this. So that really was something that struck me as well. Um,
Yeah, no,
did
it's
anything else
fascinating to
strike
find
out in
out
your
about.
mind as kind of reminding you of this time?
Oh, civil service. That was
Oh
another one that
yes,
really hit.
definitely.
Yes, and
Man,
indeed,
I tell you, yes, you're absolutely right. When I was
yeah,
writing this book, I had absolutely no idea what's happening right now would happen. But that is
yeah,
a very big standout, isn't it? Yeah, well,
it was. Oh my gosh, yes.
interestingly enough, because Garfield's it is a legacy of Garfield's life. The modern civil service system we have these large federal departments. Um,
Mhm.
they're a result of these reforms that Garfield was able to try to push through um, Congress. And sorry, I'm having issues finding a charger for this computer. I'm in, if you
It's
don't mind,
okay.
a little bit of the interference here.
No, not at all.
Sorry,
You're fine.
right there. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's better. Okay, great. Sorry, I was watching the battery count down, and I was thinking, oh man, they're going to cut me off mid answer. Yeah, but anyway, yes. So civil service reform, you probably can't think of what sounds like a more boring subject within 3 words than the phrase
Right.
civil service reform. That sounds like something that is designed to put audiences to sleep. But during the Reconstruction era, there was no more inflammatory public domestic topic in America. No more, dare I say, sexy cause on college campuses than the idea of civil service reform. And what that was, in essence, it was a movement back in Garfield's time to remove from political control the basic functions of the government. For these days, when you go to a DMV, when
Mhm.
you file your taxes, when you are arrested and you're going through the legal proceedings, um, your political affiliation, your personal political affiliation, has very little impact on how you are treated by the bureaucrats within that system. That is not true for a majority of America's early history. For a great proportion of our first century and a half or so, many of the major uh, bureaucratic jobs in our federal system of government, they were almost entirely political appointees. They were so. For example, your local post office worker, your
Mhm.
local sheriff, these would be people who would be appointed to these jobs as a result of a recommendation by your local congressman. And very often, because of the way that recommendation system worked, These people filling these nice, cushy government jobs where there were a few regulations around how they made their money, these would be cronies, political cronies of whoever's in office. So you can see it's kind of easy to infer how this became a system of corruption. People would gang together to get a patron elected. That person would then enrich the people who enabled their own election through prime jobs in government. And then these people could take money from the public coffers through those roles and then get their patron reelected. It became a cycle of graft. And actually, that's where the term political machine comes from. It's from this era. Not only that, the term "to the victor go the spoils," that's another very common phrase still to this day. That is from this period, because this cycle of graft, this was called the spoils system. And to the victor, to the winner of the congressional office, go the spoils of government jobs to dole out to their followers as they see fit. That was how that worked. And it was a key part of both parties' political apparatuses in those times. And as a matter of fact, it was integral to a lot of the rises and falls of various administrations, presidential administrations in this time. Grant lost a lot of popularity in good part because he was seen as being too reliant on the spoil system, too corrupt. Hayes came into office, Rutherford Hayes, another one of those great bearded Midwesterners we all forget about, unfortunately, which isn't fair at all.
No, I agree with you. Absolutely, we should remember these guys.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Especially since of all their valiant service in the Civil War. But Hayes came into office because he was a reformer. He was somebody who was expected to pass civil service reform, to depoliticize all of these machine operations and just make them strictly regulated parts of apolitical government. And he failed to do so. Garfield came in also on a tide of reform sentiment, but he had to strike various deals with the more corrupt elements of his party in order to get elected in the first place. And the great irony in all of that is that Garfield was the great moderate of the Republican Party of that time. He was somebody who did his fair share of patronage himself. He dabbled a little bit in the spoil system. He was not as heavy as a practitioner of it as other bigger players of that time, but he also saw the necessity of it just as a political tool. You know, if you're a politician, you need arrows in your quiver of some sort. And Garfield thought that Hayes had been a little bit too militant in his pursuit of reform. So Garfield came in having struck a lot of deals to kind of pledge a middle path on reform. He wanted to do, moderate to incremental things using presidential power. However, when he had a power schism between himself and the more corrupt elements of the party, the corrupt elements of the party were called the Stalwarts. The Stalwart, which is a great name, by the way, if you're going to pick a political faction, because they sound like hardliners, and they were in many senses. But the Stalwarts were the corrupt element. They wanted the best jobs in government to, use for their own purposes. They perceived that Garfield did not follow up on his promises to give them these. And so what ended up happening was this schism. Garfield won that political fight. He ousted the Stalwarts from power kind of by accident. But here's what happened. A supporter of the Stalwarts, who was also very mentally ill and who was looking for one of these government jobs, upon watching Garfield defeat the Stalwarts, he decided that if he then killed the president, that the new president, Chester Arthur, would be so grateful to the assassin, he would give the assassin whatever patronage job the assassin wanted. So you can see it was in this guy's calculus, it was a toxic mix of mental illness and genuine greed based off of the spoil system of that time. And as a result of Garfield's assassination, he became a great martyr for civil service reform. Serious civil service reform was passed in 1883. Because of the strength Garfield's killing had given to the cause. And for the first time, you had competitive civil service exams for people going for these spots. You had to a certain degree, this got improved over the years, but you had a relief of partisan interference in the federal bureaucracy. And federal bureaucrats, diplomats, tax assessors, Interior Department clerks, that kind of stuff, they were freed from being forced to contribute to political campaigns in exchange for their jobs, which was a big part of the spoil system beforehand. So all of those things, those were the seeds for the modern civil service we have today. Now, obviously, we are seeing suddenly civil service, something no one had ever really thought too much about, I'd argue, in the past 50 to 60 years, certainly since the last Hatch Act.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, and by the way, that's the way it should be. If the public is thinking really, really hard about civil servants, and civil servants are on the front pages, things have gone wrong. In general, civil
Since,
servants are best when they're just quietly doing their jobs and just going home. Now you have this entirely new, not new, I should say, evergreen issue coming up again. And so it's a resurrection of these things that were the themes in Garfield's life. And I'd argue, by the way, he wouldn't be surprised that many of the issues he saw in his life were coming back again
yeah.
in this time. The line that he had, for example, about race relations in America is this is something he wrote by the time he was president. And this was an issue he had, I'd argue, really agonized over for the prior 20 years. He had gone into the Civil War as a radical Republican. He was a hardliner on these issues. He said that only time is the healer of all things, with wisdom and justice at work. That was his perspective on these great divisive problems of the times that he just could not, and his era of American politician, could not figure out how to really solve. So the resurrection of those problems in a new era, maybe the nuances of it would surprise him. But again, I think you could kind of put a pin in any period of American history, and you would find something to empathize with given current times. And also, this is another thing, I can't dispute that given anybody writing with a historical perspective, whether intentionally or not, they're also writing about their own times in a way, either through their perspective and the way they're weighing things almost subconsciously, or through deliberate choices they make. And I think maybe when I was writing this, and this was 5 years ago now, maybe I was kind of juggling those two in my head a little bit. There are some things that I did certainly want to draw out. For example, the passage of the Electoral Count Act by Grover Cleveland. This was a little section that I threw in as a non sequitur at the end of the disputed election of 1876. The Electoral Count Act was signed by President Grover Cleveland, and it was to clarify, I should say, how electoral college votes are to be counted during the certification of votes after the election in Congress. And it was passed because of the chaos of the election of 1876. And when this Electoral Count Act was later signed, and as I presented in the book, this a newspaper in San Francisco wrote, if a new election crisis is ever to confront this country, this act will come to be of great value. And I saw that line, and I was like, this is going to be relevant and to whatever the setting the reader is experiencing this in. So I made sure to include a little explanation of that act, even though it fell nowhere within the timeline of Garfield's life itself.
Right.
Afterward, I thought that was a relevant thing to throw in.
Sure.
What's another example of that? Oh, yes. There's another. So Garfield, as you know, he also was this fairly prolific writer. He wrote a lot of long columns for The Atlantic, for example. And there was this column he wrote called A Century of Congress, and it was a 100-year centennial, a review of the first 100 years of America's national legislature. And one of the things that Garfield writes, he writes about the invention of the telegraph, bringing to millions of American breakfast tables what was discussed in Congress the prior day on the House floor. And he holds out a little bit of reticence in this article in 1876. He says he basically hedges on whether this is going to improve or decrease the productivity of Congress. The fact
Hmm.
that more people at home are able to follow the day-to-day speeches and operations on the floor. And as soon as I saw that he wrote that, I thought that was a very good point to also kind of just throw in there for the reader to acknowledge, because there is this longer debate about, let's say, for example, putting television cameras on the floors of
Right.
Congress. In a prior era, congressmen, when they gave speeches on the floor, they were talking to one another. Now, if you turn on C-SPAN, typically what you'll see is a House member or a senator on the floor, and nobody else is on the floor with them. They are talking to no one and everyone simultaneously, because they don't care about whoever's in there watching them. They care about the viewers at home. And, Garfield writing about technology, communications technology, changing the business of Congress in the 19th century, that also seemed very relevant to me. And
Yeah.
I threw that in as a deliberate choice because I knew that there were going to be some readers out there who read that and felt the exact same way, that there's a little bit of ambiguity there that's worth writing about. And not only that, in terms of general writing style, I was actually talking with this with another friend of mine the other day, and she's writing a book of her own, and she
Mhm.
was asking me, like, when I don't know, when I don't know what to say next, what do I write? Like, what do I do when I encounter writer's block? And I have a rule for that, actually.
Hmm.
I say, well, when in doubt, just write what happened. you know, uh, uh, they took the hill. They debated. You just go into a description of what exactly happened. And what you'll find is, rather than go into heavy analysis on an issue or an event or what somebody was thinking at the time, it is very interesting, and I found this very advantageous. There's a way of conveying a message to a reader without forcing it down their throat. There's a
Mhm.
way in which you can just describe an event or paint a scene, or otherwise fill in details that make a reader almost tell themselves what's really happening and what's actually going on. For example, you'll remember this from the book. Garfield has this very vivid nightmare when he finally is elected president. During his interregnum period, where he's president elect, he's about to, he's considering what lies ahead, and uh, a lot of bad things lie ahead, and he knows this. He's reflected on this multiple times, but he has this nightmare where he's floating on a canal boat down a river in a thunderstorm with Chester Arthur, his running
Right.
mate, another Civil War president, Chester Arthur. And they hit a huge storm, and the boat goes under. And Garfield swims to shore, and he turns back, and he sees Chester Arthur sinking under the waves. And Garfield is then suddenly naked on the beach, and he realizes this, and then he runs off into the thunderstorm. He flees. He doesn't save Chester Arthur, and then he wakes up at home. And it was such a weird anecdote and such a weird experience of a president elect. But there are a lot of ways to read that. Of course, many people have made entire livings reading people's dreams, and I couldn't make sense of that. I knew there was clearly a lot of anxiety in my subject when he's about to become president. He's having these, these very strange visions. And I thought, I don't know quite what this means. I know it's telling me something. And I bet somewhere out there, a reader is going to be able to make more sense of this than I am. So I'm just going to tell them what happened.
Right.
And then they're going to read into that, and they will get that implication as well. Yeah, so there are a lot of good opportunities like that where you can, not only are you as an author able to get people to think about current times, you can also kick it to the reader and ask them to analyze it on your behalf, which is really something special.
Yeah.
So,
No, I found that dream piece actually really, really interesting too. I mean,
yeah,
and that's something that the way you worded it almost sounded like this is a reality for him. That this is something that just happened.
yeah,
And I had to go back. I'm like, let me make sure I just read that correctly. But it brings you to the canal boat, which was something formulative. He was young, of course. This was something that
yeah.
actually surfaces a couple times in the book, which is really interesting to see. And he circles back to it himself, and there's reference to this everywhere.
He does, yes. So that was his. I'll say, and this is general advice.
Mm.
If you are trying to be an American politician, two things are very helpful. One, you need to have a very distinct physical feature that people
Mhm.
can caricaturize. It really helps if you've got giant ears, or you're very thin and very tall,
Right.
or you've got a big head. Garfield had a big head,
That's right. He
and
did.
so that made him, as a politician, you need to give people some physical feature to to really make you a caricature of, like
Mhm.
to have it be your distinctive thing when they draw political cartoons of you and stuff. The second thing is you need to have worked a good manual labor job. You need some kind of romantic, rustic, blue collar job that people can relate to, the average voter can. For Abraham Lincoln, this was the rail splitter, right?
Right.
That was Lincoln the rail splitter. For Garfield, when he was young in rural Ohio, he ran away from home one summer and he worked as a deckhand on a canal barge going up and down an industrial canal called the Ohio Canal, which doesn't exist anymore. But he was on that boat working really hard for about 6 weeks, manual labor. But based off of how often it came up as campaign imagery for the rest of his life, you'd think he'd been on that boat for 6 years.
Yeah.
I bet he spent more than 6 weeks talking about how long he was about that boat experience. Really was something else. So when he was running for president, for example, his early campaign biographies came out, and they all had the same basic title structure. They all were written from Canal Boy to President, from Canal Boy to the White House. There were all these campaign songs like Boatman Jim, and it was all about him, working the Ohio Canal
Mhm.
as a good, good blue collar all American boy kind of thing. And it was a formative period in his life for sure, and he made great hay out of it. I'm not going to say that he didn't take up this job because he knew it was going to be, politically useful to him. He did it because he was a young kid who just genuinely wanted to go find his own way in life, and he
Yeah.
did so he literally ran away from his mom. He broke her heart, but he worked for a summer on this, in this really interesting section of America, on this really interesting piece of infrastructure. And this is another thing is when I was writing about this part of the book, Garfield kept a very meticulous diary. This was also
Mhm.
very helpful from a writing perspective. Garfield was two things that were great from a writer's perspective. He wrote about absolutely everything that occurred around him, from his diary books to his letters to his poems, even to his love letters to his wife. And then not only was he that, he was also a hoarder. So
Mhm.
being a mix between a prolific writer and a hoarder, you have a lot of material to work with. And so when Garfield was working on the canal when he was younger, he wrote down the cargo manifests of the boat that he was
No
working
kidding.
on. And so what was the material he was moving? It was coal, it was copper, it was iron ore, lumber. And when I noticed that, I was like, okay, these are the raw materials of industrial transformation. And he's moving them around Ohio in the first half of the 19th century. And so that made me think, I'm like, that's a good analogy for just how the country is changing as well.
Yeah.
He's literally witnessing the nation, build up uh, with his own eyes, and so that was another fun little thing to work in. But yes, it's funny throughout the rest of his life, and you can even see this in the diary entries of other people he met with. He would always talk about how formative his years on the canal, or his time, I should say, on the canal was. And so that was just a very fun thing to unravel as well. He was a very, very good campaigner. When he ran for president in 1880, uh, he conducted what was seen as the first, at least one of the first active presidential campaigns
Mhm.
of American history. Another politician named James Blaine, who was one of James Blaine. They're just, what's tough about the Reconstruction era is it's shrouded in historical grayscale. Everybody in American popular memory, there's just something about the post Civil War period that is just ambiguous and cloudy, and no one emerges from it with any kind of color. It seems as though the time is just stuck in monochrome, in black and
Mhm.
white. And here I go going on a non sequitur. All of the characters of this time are just such vibrant and fascinating politicians. They just have so much just charisma and unique characteristics that are just so fun to drag out. So James Blaine
Hmm.
was one of the figures of that time, and he later wrote of Garfield's presidential campaign that Garfield, and this is almost verbatim, I'm going to be paraphrasing, but Blaine wrote in his own memoirs, never before had a presidential candidate dared to comment on current events during the campaign. To do so before was seen as rash, foolish, arrogant, gauche, all of those things. But the way Garfield conducted his presidential campaign, he had a farm in Northeast Ohio, in Menor, Ohio, and voters would show up on his doorstep. They would just appear and they would expect to just hang out with. Can you imagine? I don't know, in like 2012, just going to New Hampshire and just knocking on Mitt Romney's door and like, hey, what do you have for me today, Mitt?
Right.
Kind of how it was in 1880 with Garfield. People showed up on his doorstep, crowds of voters. There was a very handy railway line on the north end of the property that people would get off and go to him for. And he felt obliged to comment on current events. He felt obliged to tell voters what he thought about what was currently happening in the country and what problems he was expecting to solve. Before then, it had again been seen as unseemly for American politicians to actively campaign on their own behalf. That was seen as being too eager for the role. It was seen as breaching decorum for somebody to dare talk about, to dare say something in support of themselves for a position like the presidency.
Right.
Man, have times changed. I've talked about this with numerous people. I wish we could go back to a time where you didn't have presidential candidates speak for themselves.
That'd be awesome.
That would be great.
It would be a fantastic campaign. Can you
Oh,
imagine?
and we would escape all of the radio nonstop ads. We wouldn't
Yeah.
get those pop-ups anymore. We would have some separation from a lot of the noise that I think in general is overwhelming a lot of citizens about our political system. But anyway, in 1880, people showed up on Garfield's doorstep, and he gave these spontaneous speeches on economic matters, including tariff policy, another relevant thing for our times. He talked about the labor rights as well. One of the first, actually, there's another Garfield writer called Kenneth Ackerman who found this out. But Garfield gave the first ever speech by a presidential candidate in a foreign language during the campaign
Really?
of 1880. Yes. A bunch of German ironworkers showed up on his doorstep. And Garfield, one of those fun facts about him, he was multilingual. He was self-instructed because he, again, grew up as in a cabin, like, single mom, dirt poor. He taught himself German. So he gave a campaign speech in German and cited from memory German poetry. It's just fascinating stuff. And another trouble with the Garfield farm during the campaign of 1880 is people. Well, how should I say this? We didn't have an autograph culture back then, but people still wanted a piece of famous people. So things would go missing around the farm. People would steal things to say, this was. Fence posts would go missing. Branches of trees from his orchard would be ripped off by voters to be taken home. So he had just a bunch of hoodlums who were just coming into his house at all hours, just stripping his place.
Grabbing what they wanted.
Yeah, and there's a phrase that Rutherford Hayes said, the president preceding Garfield. Rutherford Hayes said, upon hearing of Garfield's nomination, he said, "The truth is, no man ever started so low who accomplished so much in all our nation's history than James Garfield, not even Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln." And that shows you how much of a celebrity, in some senses, he was in that time. And that has been lost in many ways. People really have forgotten him as a man because I think of the way American historical memory works. When we hear that somebody was president, we ask ourselves, what did this person do when they were president? Because in our mind, we're like, that's the only important thing they ever could have possibly done. Garfield, that's a very short story, not through no fault of his own.
No.
He did indirectly cause it. If he hadn't done a few things, he wouldn't have. I'm not victim blaming.
Yeah.
It was because of his political fight that inspired the assassin that led to him being killed. And of course, as one of your commenters has pointed out here, he didn't actually die of the gunshot. He
Right.
died of infection that was induced within him and spread very nastily throughout his body. But let's see. He was, one of these great forgotten figures of our early history, and there are a lot of gems like that in America's past.
Mm.
I think if there's anything good to come from the current polarized time we live in, um, it opens up a lot of possibilities, I think, for new scholarship or new public scholarship, I could say, of people we've neglected in the past. A lot of people are familiar with the blue chip presidential stories. Washington, everybody knows about him. Lincoln,
Yeah.
Jefferson, both of the Roosevelts.
Hmm.
Everybody knows those presidential stories like the back of their hand. But there are a lot of other people who are in that mix, and not only presidents. There are also great senators, great governors, great businessmen who built the system that we unknowingly, or I should say, uh, kind of in an entitled way, reap the yields of every day. And when you have an era like ours right now, there's a lot of opportunity for a lot more nuanced dialogue about forgotten people of the past and what they can teach us to this day. And I
I,
think Garfield was a good example of that too, in many ways.
I'd have to say the same. I mean, like I said before, coming to hear you talk, I actually haven't even owned a single Garfield book. Mine, Destiny the Republic, I've had that on the shelf. I never picked it up to read it.
That's a great one.
It's in the
Destiny.
lineup now, man. I'm telling you that. I had that and Dark Horse actually, but yours was the one I wanted to visit first because obviously the talk was fresh in my mind, and it seemed to be like the best comprehensive biography on Garfield. So something I'm going to be able to really dive into and get the best account of his life in one sitting.
That's very kind. So Dark Horse you mentioned, that's by Ken Ackerman, the guy I
That is
mentioned
Ackerman.
before.
Okay.
That's Kenneth Ackerman. His what's interesting. I don't really believe in one authoritative book about any subject. I think beyond a certain skill threshold, every author brings a different angle, a different lens. They find different things interesting about the same person, and they're able to write about it in nuanced ways. And so you get this good, comprehensive look through the. So what Ken Ackerman was very good at, his story of the nomination process and
Mhm.
Garfield's election of 1880, flawless. Destiny
Okay.
of the Republic was about Garfield's assassination and the scientific developments of the time and the general political era. Candace Millard, excellent book. There's another book by Dr. Ira Rutkow
Okay.
called James Garfield, and Rutkow is a medical doctor
Hmm.
who wrote a biography of Garfield. And as a result of his medical training, he writes maybe one of the greatest medical histories of the assassination. It's an immense detail, very well written, and Rutkow's expertise really bleeds through. So if you have any appetite for the more gruesome, the more gruesome aspects of the assassination, which are admittedly fascinating, I'd give Dr. Rutkow's book a shot.
Okay.
Alan Peskin, Dr. Alan Peskin. He is he was, I should say, because he recently passed on, but he was a Ohio-based academic who kind of devoted his entire professional life to Garfield scholarship. He's the biography that I cite most often in my own, and
Hmm.
I'd really recommend. I got to plug his book as well, Garfield by Alan Peskin. In my acknowledgments, I call him the monolith of modern Garfield scholarship, and I'm kind of I thought that was a good line for him, and I am very happy to notice other reviewers in I think it was the Claremont Review.
Hmm.
They noticed that shout out, and they appreciated that as well. So Alan Peskin is another great scholar that I have to tip my hat to. He was a wonderful man. I also heard he was quite the gentleman. Somebody described him to me as in one sentence. They said he would give you a Werther's candy from his coat pocket. That was his kind of guy. So that shows you kind of what era he's from, and also how nice he was. And yeah, so it's a it's the Garfield family is also very friendly and helpful. There's a guy called Tim Garfield who lives in
Hmm.
Ohio and who runs something called the Garfield Trail,
Okay.
which is a series of historical sites in Northeast Ohio that are about James Garfield. And he is a splitting image of
No
his.
kidding.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he's got the beard, he's got the blue eyes, he's got the height, all of these things that are key Garfield attributes. All of the Garfield men, going back to like revolutionary times, they're all very big. They're all some they've all got big heads, and they're sometimes follicularly challenged. They sometimes got a little bit of receding hairline, and they're all
Just
very strong. They're kind of
yeah.
like stanzas. They have feats of strength that
Okay.
follow. So anyway, it's fun how you can dive into these rabbit holes as a writer, as an author.
I'm glad you bring up a rabbit hole because actually,
Yeah,
something I wanted to ask you, and this
totally.
is I don't want to talk about Guto too much, and that's actually something I really appreciated in your book is that you name dropped him like twice, and
Yeah,
maybe yeah, that was awesome.
I tried to do it zero times.
Yeah, you were
So
this close,
Gito,
man.
yeah, Gito for the listeners is the assassin of Garfield. And actually, when I first submitted my draft, my editor came back and said you gotta name him at least once. And so I do name him at least
Yeah,
once.
it
But
was
anyway,
very
sorry,
brief.
I didn't mean to
No,
cut you
you're
off.
good. That's perfect. It's actually what I'm segueing into is when you said that something I've actually had a fascination with for about a year and a half now after spending some time of all places, Lorton Prison. I was able to do it. There was a
Oh,
book called
really?
Journey from the Gallows. Yeah, are you familiar with the book?
Hmm.
It's a penal history of
No, no.
Washington D.C.'s prisons, and there is an entire chapter in there dedicated to Guteau's imprisonment and the attitude that he has in there, and that there were two attempts on his life by guards.
Yes, yes.
I had
The guards kept trying to pop him.
yeah, I was just like, but to me that showed. I think, and this is the day after, or actually the night of your talk, when I came back to my apartment there, and that's the first thing I went to grab. Just like I wonder if this book would have something because he was obviously in prison and executed out of D.C. So there has to be something in this book. Sure enough, in this typewritten old font out of print book,
Mm,
there was at least 5 to 6 pages worth of coverage on Guto and how important and how angry DC was at that. Because
yes,
this is only assassination number two, and it's happening again in Washington.
yes,
So I don't know.
absolutely.
Like I said, I don't know if you ever come across that, but if you ever get a chance to, it's
I had not, and that sounds like a good read. But
yeah.
yes, the assassin was a uniquely loathsome character, and this unfortunately a side effect of that is that the press couldn't get enough of him.
Hmm.
He was somebody who was almost repulsively fascinating in terms of his motivations, his personal background. Even before he shot the president, he had done a whole host of awful things to a variety of people in his life. He was admittedly badly mentally ill, but he was also clearly just a bad person in general. And he, when he shot the president, he basked in his notoriety. He really he thought that that he would have book deals coming his way soon. He struck very uh, he struck poses for photographers in the jail cell. He Journalists came by to interview him, and he was very loquacious with journalists, and then also very mad and lecturing of them when they would, ask him if he felt bad about what he did. When he was later put on trial, repeatedly guards tried to kill him, by the way. So that kind of shows you how hard he was to get along with for extended periods of time. But he tried to claim that, so the American public had given Garfield's family, they had raised funds to look after his kids and wife after James Garfield died. And the assassin tried to argue that he was also due a payout, that the public needed to pay him money as well. He tried to insist that he hadn't killed Garfield, that the doctors had done so. And to a certain extent, he was right on that count, but that doesn't, of course, excuse the
Right,
initial.
the dude sounds full of himself at this point.
Yeah, he was
I
awful,
didn't know
and
this.
no, he was really something terrible.
Yeah.
So, but it was. So when I was reading all of this, a lot of good work, scholarship work, has been done on the assassin. as that book you mentioned details. And I didn't think I could add anything new. And I not only that, I didn't think that I didn't want to name him again.
Yeah.
I thought he had already gotten more than he was due,
No, and
and
I
I
appreciated that. That
yeah
was I honestly like. I was like, come on, I don't even want to see the name. I was so
yeah
close. Yes, there's none, but I do get the obviously having to name it. That makes
yeah
so
yeah.
much sense.
Well, and that's not to knock anybody who chose to write more
Right.
about them, but I the mixture of not having anything to add and this like it didn't a book about the president, it didn't seem fair to talk about who the a lot about the man who killed the president. You know what I
Right.
mean? If the subject himself had seen that book, I think he would have, he would have hated to see his killer be extensively
Just yeah.
profiled in any way. And then, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, I think our generation, sadly, I mean, we've seen this happen before. People do terrible things,
Hmm.
often with guns,
Yep.
and then they get their name in lights, not
Yeah.
flattering lights, but lights nonetheless. And increasingly that we've become much more savvy, I think, from a media perspective about when this happens. You don't romanticize the people who did it.
Absolutely. No, and that's what I loved about it. It was just
Yeah,
like
so that was
he
kind of
barely
good.
gets a passing, but the thing about the book too, it progresses so well, and it's like a flashpoint too. And I think that serves two purposes. One, like you just said, we're not going to romanticize the guy that just killed the president or that shot the president,
Hmm.
but you go through and it shows you, I think, how quick this happens from a long life, a successful career in the house, on the field of battle in the Civil War, not taking a bullet,
Yes,
to just
yes,
and
just gone
life
like
just
that.
yeah, the life completely changed.
Americans had seen a president be assassinated before. They had seen presidents be deathly ill and
Hmm.
die of illness. They had not seen a president be badly wounded and then die slowly. Like
Yeah.
that was a spectacle, and we had just evolved into from a technological perspective, from a media perspective, to have the equivalent of wall to wall coverage
Hmm.
of a dying president. And so, just from a media standpoint, the frenzy, the fascination, the sorrow and the mourning, it was a spectacular, literally a spectacular. It was a spectacle
Right.
ending to what was already an incredible life. And it was a privilege to write about it. I feel very lucky to have done so. And I still find James Garfield to be the most elusive and fascinating man of the 19th century America. And inevitably, more people, if I did a little bit to heighten awareness of him, I feel happy.
Hundred
Um,
percent.
but I predict there is a lot more to be learned from that, and he will continue to be a deep well of historical research for people moving forward in a lot of ways. A lot of historians had exposure to him, and so if you find anybody who's like a scholar of the Civil War, of the Reconstruction era, of the Gilded Age, he appears as a character surprisingly often,
Hmm.
and but relatively few had dug deeper than that from a scholarly perspective. They know of him, biographers of Lincoln, Grant, Hayes, Chester Arthur, of course, Ben Harrison, all these guys. They all had exposure to James Garfield, and everybody was intrigued by him. But he was, because of his assassination and the way he ended his life, he remained the great what if of American history. But the
Sure.
deeper you dig, the more interesting he was as a guy. And again, the more reflective he was of our evolution of a nation in general. He was not a perfect man. You know that after reading the book.
Yeah.
He he had many flaws. He was at times, to say the least, not a great husband. Uh, he was, he had questionable views, to say the least, about Native Americans. He
Hmm.
had what was seen as a very progressive attitude of the time, but there's a heavy asterisk on that sentence when we
That's right.
say that. He he was a flip flopper on civil rights issues towards the end of Reconstruction. Um, he fought only necessary fights, and then there were times, of course, where I don't know if you could say if he was guilty of corruption, but he certainly, at times, he accepted money from people that he really shouldn't have. And that's a nuanced point to make. Nevertheless, he is a great vehicle to explore the story of 19th century America, including the Civil War, which is your usual
Yeah.
area of expertise. And because of that, I felt it was a real privilege to use his life and explore that, and then through him explore the times in which he lived. And that's kind of the ideal balance you want to strike as a biographer, really.
I think so. And you have done Garfield a tremendous amount of justice with your book. From someone who just again knew in passing, oh, he was a Chickamauga, oh, he was a president. I mean, you're right. The assassination does so overshadow all the accomplishments and just the life that Garfield lived out up until the point of the assassination. It just doesn't get the amount of details. So you've done him some serious justice with that book, and again, I
Yeah.
want to appreciate all the work you put into that because you've created an interest in me too. I am very interested in Garfield now.
Thank you.
I have a lineup of books next I want to dive into. And I was glad I could start with yours. Your talk was great. The book was
That's great. Well, thank you
phenomenal.
so much, and
Yeah.
it's great coming to talk to you about it as well. Yeah, I've sometimes thought people, readers, you can tell by reader mail. Generally, people think that they either think I've been too nice or too mean to him, and if you can stack those different piles of mail and they're the same height, you've done a good job.
Absolutely.
I think that's a line I heard a while ago from a historian
I like
at
that.
UVA, and I think if I met him in person, I don't think he would be too mad at me, because like when you're a biographer, you have to talk about unpleasant parts of somebody's life, so
Hmm.
they're never going to be totally jazzed with the way you've talked about them.
No.
But I think he would see that this was an effort to do right by him, and I certainly hope I have. And thank you so much for those words.
Yeah, no, and they're earned, man. They were awesome. But
All right.
as we come to the wrap up point here, I just want to ask: is there any last minute thoughts you wanted to add about Garfield before we wrap it up here?
Yeah, I so he the phrase that I've decided to land on with Garfield, I wish I'd put it in the book, and I think I said this to you beforehand. Uh, he was a pathologically reasonable person. He was the rare American politician who really meditated a lot on the nature of our institutions, and who, when he was presented with a political opponent, he acknowledged the humanity of the person across the aisle from him. And whenever he thought that he was being unfair to his political opponents, he would make a real effort to restrain himself, to make things right, to keep other Republicans in line. He was the epitome of a political moderate and somebody who remained defiantly open minded on the issues of the times. Now, and for that, people found him very pleasant to deal with. They also found him very frustrating to work with at times because he could change his mind. There are downsides to being, obsessively focused on pleasing everybody. And so I think he embodied both the positives and negatives of that style of politics, because after all, in many ways, you could say that political moderation, there are elements of that you're effectively kicking the most difficult issues of your time for the next generation to solve. And for all of Garfield's wisdom and character and courage, there were some things that he was slippery and not apathetic, but he was willing to believe in the destiny of the republic. That was a phrase of his that he used a lot. And for lack of a better term, if I might paraphrase, MLK Jr., that the moral arc of our nation is long, but it bends towards justice. That was his perspective on many things. Create a lot of contradictions in the man. He was a very contradictory person. Who isn't? But I find him. I'm going to be thinking about him for the rest of my life. I'm pretty confident.
Absolutely, man.
All
Well,
right.
Charlie, I have a picture of the book here in case anyone wants.
Oh,
It's
there we go.
President Garfield from Radical to Unifier. I also put two links in the comments. We have Charlie's website, cwgoodyearbooks.com, and then I put the Simon & Schuster link if you wanted to buy the book. I think there's some outlets on there for you to choose from to buy it. So that way I'm not just throwing Amazon at you. If you want to get them from anywhere, there's
That's right. Well, I
choices there.
appreciate it, Tyler. This is really fun. I enjoyed this
Absolutely.
conversation. I hope I didn't ramble on.
Not at all.
I'm like Woody Guthrie. I can roam and ramble.
I'm here to listen, man. That's the best part about it. When your next book comes out, I'll be in touch.
Absolutely, that sounds
Yeah, I'm
great.
excited for
I'd
it.
love to be back on. Thank you so much.
100%. Thank you for joining, and everybody, we will see you on the next one.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.